Hey everyone. Relationships, am I right? Sometimes they can feel like a puzzle, figuring out how to truly understand each other. And that's exactly why we're diving deep today.
Into this episode someone sent in.
Yeah. It's called Understanding Each Other, and it's a conversation between, well, a man and a woman.
About all the ways they can misunderstand each other.
Right. And we're going to unpack all those little communication mysteries.
See what we can learn?
Exactly. So, one of the big takeaways right off the bat.
Oh, yeah, that men fix women feel thing.
It's so true, though, isn't it? Like, the podcast hosts actually bringing up this study where they looked at brain activity while people were, dealing with emotional stuff.
And men's brains, apparently, they light up in the problem-solving areas.
Like, gears are turning. But for
Yeah.
women, it's more the empathy zones that are going wild.
Makes you wonder if we're even wired differently sometimes.
Right. It's not just a stereotype. It's like, maybe there's some real science behind it.
And it's not about saying one way is better or worse, just that we come at things from different angles.
Exactly. It's like, imagine your car breaks down.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
Right. So the guy's immediately thinking, okay, how do I fix this? What tools do I need?
While you're like, ugh, this is ruining my whole day. I'm stranded.
Totally. He's in solution mode. She's in feeling mode.
Both valid reactions, just
Yeah.
different ways of processing the situation.
And the podcast, it didn't let women off the hook either. They talked about how, sometimes we say, I'm fine, when we're clearly not fine.
Or expect our partners to be mind readers.
Okay, yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that myself. But what the podcast said was interesting. It's not just about being confusing. It's more like we all have different ways of showing what's going on inside.
And that's where active listening comes in, which they said is super important for men.
Oh, yeah, they mentioned that. Tell me more.
They even talk about this technique called mirroring, where you basically reflect back what you're hearing to make sure you're on the same page emotionally.
So instead of jumping to solutions,
You're first making sure you understand the feelings behind what's being said.
I like that. Takes the guesswork out of it.
Right. But then, of course, it takes two to tango, right? The podcast also talked about how women can be more direct about their needs.
Oh, for sure. Like, instead of hinting around, just come out and say it.
It's about finding that balance, being honest, but also clear.
Totally. And it's a dance, isn't it? Relationships, I mean. It takes practice to get in sync.
And the podcast really emphasized that it's a journey, not a destination.
And speaking of journeys, they went on to talk about how men and women often have totally different ideas about what a relationship should look like.
Yeah, like those expectations we bring to the table.
Right. Like, is it all about shared activities or emotional connection or what?
And I think it's important to remember how much society and culture play into that.
Like what we're taught growing up.
For example, maybe men are raised to think, okay, a good relationship means doing things together, having fun.
While women might be more focused on that deep emotional bond, spending quality time together.
It's like we're coming in with these pre-written scripts.
That makes so much sense. It makes me wonder, have you ever felt that disconnect in your own relationships? Like those expectations clashing?
Oh, absolutely. I think most people have at some point. What's interesting is that the podcast said these expectations aren't set in stone.
Like they can change over time.
Right. As we grow and our needs in the relationship shift.
That's actually really reassuring. So if those expectations can change, how do we actually bridge that gap? What did the podcast say?
Well, they had some really helpful takeaways. They stressed active listening for men, clear communication of needs for women.
And expressing appreciation for both? That one really hit home for me. It's so easy to forget to acknowledge those little things our partners do for us,
It's true. Those small gestures can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I remember this one time.
Oh, I love a good story. Tell me about it.
Okay, so picture this. It was one of those weeks where everything was going wrong, work was crazy, the house was a mess.
I've been there.
Right, and I was just totally overwhelmed. And my partner, he saw I was struggling, and he just, without saying anything, took over dinner duty.
Oh, that's sweet.
I know. He didn't try to fix anything or give advice. He just took that one thing off my plate.
Sometimes that's all you need.
Exactly. It was such a small gesture, but it completely changed my mood. It made me feel like seen and supported in a way that words couldn't have.
Sometimes actions really do speak louder.
Right. It's a good reminder that showing love and care, sometimes it's about those little things.
Absolutely. And that actually ties in perfectly with what the podcast said about understanding your partner's love language.
Oh, yeah, those 5 love languages.
Exactly. Whether it's acts of service, words of affirmation, gifts, quality time, or physical touch,
Yep.
everyone feels loved in different ways.
So true, which is why communication is so important, right?
Right.
We need to be able to say what we need and understand how our partner receives love best.
It's a learning process for sure.
Speaking of learning, the podcast really drove home the point that relationships, they take work.
No such thing as a free lunch.
Right. It's not always going to be easy or perfect.
I'm curious about this whole idea of work, though. Did they give any examples of what that might look like in everyday life?
That's a great question. And that's where things get really interesting.
Well, they did. They said it's not about, like, grand gestures or constantly trying to fix things.
Okay, good. That takes the pressure off.
Right. It's more about, like, a series of small, consistent efforts.
I can get behind that.
Like making an effort to really listen when your partner's talking, even if you're tired or you've had a long day.
Oh, yeah. That's a tough one sometimes. Putting the phone down, actually being present.
But it makes a difference. Tuning in instead of tuning out.
For sure. And it goes both ways, right? They talked about how women need to clearly say what they need.
Instead of expecting their partner to just know.
Right. Yeah, no more hinting around.
Be honest, be clear.
Exactly. Like we were saying before with that whole I'm fine thing.
And another thing they mentioned that I thought was interesting was the importance of expressing appreciation.
Oh, yeah, like saying thank you.
Exactly. It's easy to take our partners for granted when we're busy, but those little acknowledgments can really go a long way.
It's funny, we're talking about all this work in relationships, but when it's done right, it doesn't actually feel like work, does it?
That's a great point. I think the work part comes in when we resist these things, when we're not willing to budge on our communication styles or expectations.
It's like anything else, the more resistance, the harder it feels.
Exactly. But when we're open to learning and growing together, it becomes more of an adventure than a chore.
Oh, I like that. An adventure. It's like we're exploring uncharted territory together.
Exactly. There's that sense of discovery and excitement.
Speaking of which, what stood out to you the most from this podcast? Anything that really surprised you or made you think differently?
You know what really struck me was how much they emphasized empathy.
Trying to see things from your partner's point of view.
Yeah. Even if you don't understand or agree with it.
Empathy is huge, right? It's
Yeah.
like the foundation for any healthy relationship.
Absolutely. Without it, you're just two ships passing in the night.
But it's not always easy, is it? To really put yourself in someone else's shoes.
No, it's definitely a skill that needs to be practiced and cultivated.
But like any skill, you can get better at it over time.
And that brings us to the final thought from the podcast, which I think is really powerful.
Okay, what's that?
They said relationships take work, but what does that work actually look like? What small steps can we take today based on what we've learned?
That's a great question. It's one thing to talk about it, but how do we actually put it into practice?
Exactly. Maybe it's making a conscious effort to listen more attentively tonight, or expressing your appreciation for something your partner did.
Or even just acknowledging your own communication style and how it might be impacting your relationship.
Those are all great starting points. It's about taking these insights and actually doing something with them.
Turning knowledge into action.
Exactly. This deep dive has given you so much to think about when it comes to relationships.
But as the podcast said, the real work happens in those everyday interactions.
So go out there, communicate with intention, practice empathy, and keep those relationships thriving.
You know, before we wrap up, there's something that wasn't explicitly mentioned in the podcast, but I think it's worth bringing up.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So they talked a lot about open communication.
Right, which is crucial.
But what happens when you and your partner have totally different communication styles?
Oh, like what if one person loves deep conversations and the other prefers to keep things short and sweet?
Exactly. How do you bridge that gap?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's like we all have our own communication language, and sometimes those languages need a translator.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not about forcing your partner to change their style. It's about finding a way to meet in the middle.
Finding that common ground where both partners feel heard and understood.
It reminds me of that saying, love is a verb. It's not just a feeling, it's an action.
That's so true. It's the effort we put in every day to connect with our partner and nurture the relationship.
And those small choices we make, they add up over time.
Absolutely. Love is a choice we make every single day. And it's through those choices, big and small, that we create a lasting bond.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's about finding what works for you as a couple. And that might mean compromising or trying new things.
Or even talking to a therapist.
Right. And recognizing that it's a journey, not a destination.
We're always learning.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And the more effort we put into understanding each other, the more rewarding those relationships become.
So to our listener, we hope this deep dive into men, women, and communication has given you some things to think about.
We just scratched the surface, but hopefully it sparks some new ideas for your own relationships.
And remember that there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's about finding what works for you and your partner.
Keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep that conversation going.
Until next time.